Hello everyone, it's Ellen from EVPL Oakland. Welcome to Chapter Book Storytime. On this week's edition of the Variety Pack, I've got a mystery to solve. It's called Missing on Superstition Mountain by Elise Broach. Just take a look at the cover and you'll see what a great mystery this is going to be. You've got the mountains in the background, and where's everybody standing? Oh, they're in a cemetery. So I want to know what this story is about. And then look here at the top, 3 skulls. It sounds like an exciting, maybe a little bit spooky mystery to solve. Let's take a look. Missing on Superstition Mountain by Elise Broach. Chapter 1. Josie runs away. The day Josie ran away was the beginning of everything. The bones in the canyon, the haunted mountain, the buried treasure, the town full of secrets. But the Barker boys didn't know it then. All they knew was that Josie was missing again, and they had to find her. It would be harder here in this strange place in the middle of the desert, but they had no idea how hard or what else they would find while they were looking. Josie and the Barker boys had just moved to an old brown shingled house in Superstition, Arizona, a town in the shadow of an enormous craggy mountain called Superstition Mountain. So far, the Barker boys didn't much like it. The house itself was all right. It had belonged to their great uncle Hank Cormody, or Crazy Uncle Hank, as Mr. Barker called him. Uncle Hank was a former cattle wrangler, gambler, and scout for the U.S. Cavalry, who had shockingly left the house to Mr. Barker in his will when he died at the ripe old age of 86. The timing for a move was good. Mr. Barker's stonemasonry business in Chicago was slowing down, cause for many worrisome late-night conversations between Mr. and Mrs. Barker when they thought the boys weren't listening. Since Mrs. Barker was a medical illustrator who could paint pictures of arthritic hips and diseased kidneys anywhere, a hasty decision had been made that a free house in a cheap part of the country was exactly what the Barker family needed, which mostly it was. The house had a bedroom for each of the boys and a big finished basement, one side of which was crammed full of Uncle Hank's belongings, taped boxes and musty furniture that Mrs. Barker had banished from the upstairs. On the wall was a dartboard, which was a nice surprise because Mrs. Barker would never let the boys get a dartboard, but she could hardly say no when one was hanging right there, with a fistful of pointy darts in the center. Another good thing, Uncle Hank's backyard didn't end in another backyard, or a street, or a driveway like other backyards. It ended in a vast, rolling nothingness of hills and fields. The boys liked that, the sense that there were no limits, and if somebody hit a ball over the scrubby border of trees and bushes, it might go sailing on forever. But, well, there were a lot of buts. The house was far from their friends in Chicago. It was far from the park where they played baseball. It was far from the hill where they used to sled and have snowball fights in the winter. Why, Arizona didn't even have winters. What kind of a place didn't have snow? Worst of all, their new house was in this strange town, full of strange people, where nobody looked or talked or seemed the least bit like the people back home. "Oh, it's just because you don't know them yet," their father said. But even their mother, who was annoyingly upbeat about everything, had to admit that the town of Superstition lived up to its name. When the middle Barker boy, Henry, said, "Oh, the people here are shifty," she laughed. Well, because she always laughed at Henry's funny words. But after a minute, she nodded and said, "You know, that's a really good word for it." There were 3 Barker boys. Simon, the oldest, was 11. He had spiky brown hair and a curious, science-y personality, which led to many interesting ideas and experiments. But he could be an annoying know-it-all and greedy at times. Jack, the youngest, was 6. He was hands down the bravest, not just about little things like spiders, but about crashing his bike and jumping from high places. Jack, however, had a temper and would rather take a swing at somebody than work things out peacefully. In the middle was Henry, age 10, a year younger than Simon and 4 whole years older than Jack. But because Henry was small and slight and Jack was big and sturdy, people always assumed that Henry and Jack were around the same age. This was quite embarrassing for Henry. Almost as bad as when he was 5 and his long curly hair had led everybody to think that he was a girl. Henry loved to read and use strange words he found in books, though not always the right way. Also, while Henry got along with nearly everybody, he never had a best friend. Mrs. Barker said, "Oh, Hen, look at your father. He's 41 and he still doesn't have a best friend." Somehow that wasn't very comforting. The final member of the Barker family was Josie. Was she the boy's sister? No. Their nanny? Definitely not. In fact, Henry often thought that if you were to compare Josie to Nana, the dog nanny in the book Peter Pan, you would quickly see that there are no comparisons. Josie was the Barker's cat, and she had little interest in taking care of anybody, least of all the 3 Barker boys. She had been with Mr. and Mrs. Barker for a very long time, and she was vaguely put out that the boys existed at all. Josie was mostly black, with a patch of white on her neck, shaped like Florida. She did not enjoy being squeezed or picked up, though that didn't keep Jack from squeezing and picking her up. Henry liked to say that she was dexterous, which meant she could open doors and grab things with her paws. Most importantly, she was good at leaping and climbing. On the day Josie ran away, the boys were sitting on their deck after lunch, staring glumly at the pebbly stretch of backyard, trying to think of something to do. Superstition did not have much to offer. The town center consisted of a library, a grocery store, a gas station, a diner, a town hall with the police and fire stations, a post office, and Coronado Elementary School, which went all the way up to 8th grade. There were a couple of businesses too, a car repair place and Mr. Barker's masonry shop, but that was it. Rows of houses sprang up in a square grid around the main avenue through town, and surrounding them, only barren desert. Even the high school was miles away in the town of Terra Calda. This was the first week of summer, and half of the Barkers' neighborhood appeared to have left on vacation. This is the view outside their house, the backyard. Not that it mattered, as Henry pointed out. The boys hadn't made any friends since they'd moved in at the beginning of June, happily missing their last week of school back in Chicago. Here in Arizona, they were on their own. "We could play cards," Henry suggested. "Too boring," said Simon. "We could play Frisbee," said Jack. "Too windy," said Simon. "We could go see Dad," said Henry. Simon shook his head. "Remember what happened last time?" Mr. Barker's work involved building walls, patios, and walkways. Most of his big jobs were in Phoenix, but he had a few projects in Superstition and the neighboring towns. The boys liked to visit him while he was working, especially whenever he needed help with cement. But the last time hadn't turned out so well. Jack's sneaker had ended up permanently cast in a stretch of sidewalk. They sat and thought a bit longer. "I know," Simon declared. "Let's play prison. Jack, you crawl under the deck, and Henry and I will be the guards." He was just starting to elaborate when Josie, who had been lying peacefully in the warm sun, leapt to her feet and darted across the yard, straight through the clump of scraggly trees in the direction of Superstition Mountain. "Where's she going?" Jack demanded. "Josie!" He jumped up and ran after her. Henry glanced at the house. Technically, they were not supposed to leave their yard, and they were especially not supposed to go up Superstition Mountain. Their parents were very strict about that mountain. "Jack!" Simon warned. He looked at Henry and shrugged. "Josie doesn't know her way around here. She might get lost." He ran after Jack, calling over his shoulder, "You tell Mom!" Henry scowled. He was often put in the position of breaking bad news to one or the other of his parents, because Simon considered it beneath him to relay information, and Jack couldn't be relied upon to get the message right. Henry yanked open the sliding glass door and yelled in the vague direction of his mother's study, "Mom, Josie ran away and we're going after her." He slammed the door to her faint, "You boys stay close to the house." Henry crossed the yard, then trotted up the rough slope of the foothills. Giant saguaro cactuses rose from the sandy ground, their prickly arms held upright like soldiers saluting. The reddish-brown peaks and bluffs of Superstition Mountain loomed in the distance. Henry could see Simon and Jack, and Josie far ahead, a black stretch against the light earth. Where was she going? That was the thing about Josie. You never knew what she was thinking. Sometimes when Henry stroked her head, she'd purr with lazy pleasure, and then a minute later hiss and bat his hand with her claws. He caught up with his brothers, who had stopped running. June in Arizona is fiercely hot, not like Illinois. At least there was a wind today, even if it did blow dry dust in their faces. Simon and Jack were yelling for Josie, but Henry couldn't see her anywhere. She never came when they called anyway. "Where'd she go?" Henry asked, squinting into the hills, past the spiked grasses and bright yellow clumps of wildflowers. The strong sun made crisp shadows on the ground. "She climbed over those rocks." Simon ran his hand through his hair till it stood up even more. The boys gathered in an uncertain huddle, staring at Superstition Mountain. They all knew Superstition Mountain was off limits, but it wasn't clear why. Their mom had said something about mountain lions and rattlesnakes. Their dad just said they could get lost. Jack scrambled up on top of a boulder. "I see her," she said. "She's way up there. Come on." Chapter 2, Up the Mountain. Henry hesitated. "Do you think it's okay to go up the mountain?" Simon considered for a moment. "Look, there's kind of a trail. We can break off branches from the bushes and stick them in the ground so we can find our way back." That sounded like something Uncle Hank might have done in his Army Scout days, Henry thought. Reassured, he began breaking branches off the brittle shrubs and propping them in the ground as they walked, avoiding the sharp spines of the prickly pears and the giant cactuses. Soon the slope became steeper and rockier. Jack still ran ahead, but Henry could hear him panting from the effort. Lizards skittered across the sandy ground. Henry grabbed the sharp edges of boulders to pull himself up, the sun hot on his back, sweat coursing down his forehead. The trail turned back on itself. It faded into thickets of brush, then reappeared. They kept climbing. "So where are we?" Jack wanted to know. Henry looked around at the twisty, boulder-strewn landscape. "I don't know." They climbed on. Behind them, the flat land stretched, speckled with distant houses of superstition and divided by a thin stripe of highway. Ahead lay the tangle of cliffs and peaks. After a while, Jack asked fretfully, "Do you see Josie?" Henry shook his head. Had she really come all the way up here? It seemed like they'd left home a long time ago. Overhead, a large dark bird wheeled against the blue sky. "Is that a hawk?" Henry asked Simon. "Yeah," said Simon, "or a vulture." Henry shuddered. Simon kicked at the dry ground, scattering pebbles. A fat gray toad jumped out from under a rock. "Look!" Jack cried, pointing. None of them were used to the strange desert creatures so different from the squirrels and robins of Chicago. It reminded Henry of the Swiss Family Robinson, a book he'd read about people marooned on a Pacific island who were always bumping into exotic wildlife. Simon, who would usually have been intrigued by the toad, barely glanced at it. "We should have brought water," he said, staring at the cloud of dust where his sneaker had been. They kept climbing. There were a few trees now, and the sunlight filtered through, dappling the ground. The boys stopped to catch their breath. The mountain's loneliness filled the air with small, mysterious sounds. The high twittering of birds, the rustling of branches. Jack poked through the brush, and Simon snapped, "Don't go off the trail, Jack." "But I can't see Josie anymore." Henry collapsed against a boulder. The sun had shifted in the sky. "I don't like it up here," he said. It's eerie." Simon turned to him. "What are you scared of? Mountain lions?" "No," Henry protested. He was a little scared of mountain lions, not to mention rattlesnakes. But it was more than that. The quiet was creepy. It felt like they were being watched, like the mountain was holding its breath. Simon climbed up on Henry's rock for a better view, shading his eyes with his hand. He looked like a real explorer, Henry thought enviously. "There's no sign of Josie," he said after a minute. "We should go back." "And leave her here by herself?" Henry was horrified. He wanted to go home, but how could they abandon Josie? "Yeah!" Jack ran down the path to where they were sitting. "We can't do that. Mom says there are mountain lions. What if she gets eaten?" "Eaten?" Simon snorted. "What's going to eat Josie? She can take care of herself." "Back home she could," Henry said, "but here's different. She's not used to it." Henry thought about how he'd feel if his brothers left him alone on the mountain when it was getting dark. Despite the heat, he shivered. Simon looked exasperated. "Hen, we don't have any water. That's what people die of in places like this, not mountain lions." Jack started to climb the boulder. "Make room for me!" He pushed Simon's leg. Simon frowned at him. "No, it's too crowded." "Is not." "Is too." "Is not." Jack's foot dug into Henry's back as he crawled past him. "Hey!" Henry complained. "Jack, stop," Simon said, trying to keep his balance. "Move over," Jack insisted. "Watch out," Henry cried as Jack slammed into his shoulder. But it was too late. Simon took a step to the side just as Jack tried to give him another push, and Jack went tumbling over the top of the boulder. Crunch! He disappeared in a dense thicket. Then there was a fast crackling sound, and to their horror, Henry and Simon realized that Jack hadn't just fallen to the ground, he was rolling down a hill. "Hey!" Jack cried. They could hear his body bumping and thumping against the hard earth. Chapter 3, The Hidden Canyon. Henry and Simon quickly climbed over the boulder and slid down the other side, grabbing at branches so they wouldn't fall. The ground pitched sharply into a narrow canyon, well hidden from view by rocks and brush. "Jack?" Henry called. They stared into the ravine. Its rock walls were steep and reddish-brown in the fading sun, with stunted shrubs growing here and there. The ground was 60 or 70 feet below, a thin strip of pebbles broken by gray-green bushes and small trees. It looked as if there'd been a stream down there once, but now it was only a dry, stony path. The wind whistled forlornly through the narrow chute. "Jack!" Simon bellowed, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. Finally, Jack's voice drifted up to them. "I'm down here!" Henry could see sunlight flashing off Jack's sandy brown hair several yards below. He was huddled on a ledge. "Don't move!" Henry yelled. "You look like you're precarious!" "No, I'm not," Jack yelled back, "but I might fall." "That's what it means," Henry answered. "Oh," Jack said, "say it normal. And I'd better not fall or I'll be all broken up in pieces. It's a long way down to the bottom." "Hold on, we're coming." Simon began scooting down the canyon wall. "Are you okay?" Henry gingerly followed, gripping one tree branch, then another to keep from slipping. "I think so," Jack mumbled, "but hurry up." A minute later, they were together on the ledge, a slab of rock jutting into the air high above the canyon floor. When he peered over the side, Henry felt sick to his stomach. Jack, meanwhile, was covered in dirt with bits of twigs and grass strewn through his hair. "Ow!" he moaned. "That hurt." "Yeah, well, serves you right for trying to knock me off," Simon complained. "Simon," Henry warned, seeing the look on Jack's face. That was the thing about Jack. He could go from fine to furious in less time than it took to call him a baby. He was kind of like Josie in that way. "We should head back," Henry said quickly. "It'll be dark soon." He glanced at the sky. If the sun went down, they wouldn't even be able to see the sticks that were meant to guide them home. Then something caught his eye. A few feet away on the edge of the rock, hanging over the canyon, there were 3 round white objects, like very big softballs, plunked in a row. "What are those?" he asked, leaning forward on his knees. Simon stood up slowly, pressing one hand against the rock wall. "Yeah, what are those?" Jack crawled over and picked one up. "It looks like a—" he began, turning it over. They all gasped. It was a skull. A human skull. Chapter 4, Which Way? The skull was bleached from the sun, with yawning eye sockets and a single row of crowded teeth. Henry froze. Jack was so startled he almost dropped it. Wide-eyed, he set it gently on the ground, where it grinned fiercely back at them. Henry had seen the skulls their mother drew for medical textbooks and journals. Pale, shadowy orbs with vacant eye holes and grim, toothy smiles. But somehow, seeing one for real was different. "What's that doing here?" Henry's voice quaked. "I don't know," Simon said, "but look, there are 3 of them." He walked carefully to the edge of the rocky outcropping and lifted up another one of the skulls, turning it over in his hands. "Oh, Mom would love this," he said softly. Henry could tell that Simon was trying to act like he wasn't scared, which somehow made him feel worse. Gently, he picked up the third skull. It was heavier than he expected, with thick, wavy lines crossing the top. "It looks like it was glued together," he whispered. "They're all that way," Simon said, tracing a finger over one of the seams. "Those lines are where the skull comes together after your brain grows to full size." How did Simon know this stuff? Simon saw Henry's look and shrugged. "Mom told me." "What's this then?" Henry asked, rubbing his finger over a shallow depression in the bone. It looked like a dent in a ping-pong ball. "Huh." Simon set down the skull he was holding and took Henry's. "Well, that's interesting. The others don't have that." "It's bashed in," Jack announced, "like this. Wham!" And he walloped Henry's arm. "Ow!" Henry gasped. "Cut it out, Jack!" He touched the curve of the indentation. "It's so smooth," he said. "I think we should put them back," Simon said suddenly. He squatted at the edge of the rocky ledge, arranging the three skulls exactly where the boys had found them. Then he stood, brushed his hands on his pants, and squinted at the wall of the canyon. "Let's go. It'll be dark soon." Henry stood where he was, mesmerized by the skulls. "It's like they're looking at something in the canyon," he whispered, "all lined up like that." The skulls were poised on the lip of rock, facing out over the void. "Do you think," Jack swallowed, "do you think a mountain lion killed them?" "On what? Put their heads in a row like this? Come on, Jack." Simon scoffed. Jack glowered at him. "Well, how'd they die? Something killed them." Henry felt a chill of foreboding. "And there are three of them," he said slowly, "like three of us." "Henry," Simon shot him a warning glance, "you're freaking out Jack." But Henry couldn't help it. Here they were in this lonely, secret place with the heads of three dead people. "What if they got stuck and died here?" Jack said. "What if we can't get out?" "Oh, that's dumb," Simon said impatiently. "We got into the canyon, didn't we?" Jack frowned at him, but Henry could see his mouth quivering, as if he might cry. Simon saw it too, and he relented. "Look, Jack," he brushed dust off the ridges of one skull. "It's pretty clean and white from the sun, so you can tell it's been here a long time. This is somebody who died years ago." "Three people," Henry whispered. "Yeah," Simon said. "Do you think we should take them back with us?" "And do what? Show Mom and Dad?" Simon wiped his hands on his pants. "We aren't even allowed to be up here." "Yeah," Jack's eyes widened. "We'll get in trouble, and they won't let us near this place ever again." Henry wasn't so sure he wanted to go to this place ever again. But Josie was here, somewhere, and what if she couldn't find her way home? They would have to come back and look for her. Henry bit his lip. "But we shouldn't just leave them, should we?" Simon thought for a minute. "I bet they've been here for years and years, Hen. A while longer won't make any difference." He wedged his foot into the rock and started to haul himself back up the slope. "Come on, let's go." Henry boosted Jack onto the rocky slope above the ledge. They followed Simon, crawling on their knees, grabbing at rocks and shrubs. Henry glanced back once at the three white skulls staring out over the gorge. Who did they belong to? How had they gotten there? "Hurry," Simon said. "It's almost dark." Henry ran after Simon, urging Jack to keep up. "Do you think there are more mountain lions in the day or at night?" Jack asked. "Oh, it's the same probably," Simon said, "but I think you have to worry about rattlesnakes more during the day when it's warm." Well, at least that was something, thought Harry. The trail forked up ahead. Simon paused. "It's this way, right?" he asked Henry. "Where are the sticks?" Henry peered down each twisting, narrow path. It was hard to even call them paths. "This way," Simon decided, scanning the darkening sky. They started running again, stumbling over rough ground, the big brown rocks crowding around them. Finally, they saw a stick upright in the dirt. They'd gotten off their trail somehow, but here they were back on it. Simon's face relaxed. We're almost there, look. And sure enough, past the barren foothills, Henry could see the twinkling lights of the houses in their neighborhood. He glanced nervously back at the mountain. Poor Josie, he said quietly. Yeah, Simon said, but she'll be okay. She always is. The boys ran the rest of the way, over the empty fields, past the tall cactuses standing watch at the edge of their yard. As they tromped onto the deck, Henry skidded to a halt. In the bright kitchen, he could see Mr. and Mrs. Barker, sober-faced, talking to a policeman. They hadn't even reached the door when Mr. Barker yanked it open, his face awash in relief. "Where were you boys?" he demanded, pulling them inside. Simon shot Henry a warning glance, which Henry instantly understood. They couldn't say anything about where they'd been. Their parents were clearly freaked out already. But what was going on? They'd been late for dinner lots of times in Illinois, and nobody ever called the police. Mrs. Barker clasped Jack against her waist. "Oh, I was so worried. Henry, I told you not to go far. What happened?" The policeman, a heavy man in a navy blue uniform, leaned on the kitchen counter waiting for their answer. He didn't look unfriendly exactly, Henry decided, but his hands were as big as baseball mitts. Henry took a deep breath. "We were just trying to catch Josie. She ran out of the yard and we followed her, but we couldn't find her." Mr. Barker folded his arms, looking from Henry to Simon. "Did you boys go up the mountain?" he asked evenly, sounding merely curious. That was a trap, Henry knew. And if they said yes, the whole kitchen would explode. Jack said, "Well, Josie..." Henry shook his head quickly. Jack was easily fooled. Simon interjected. "Josie ran through the bushes out back, so we followed her. Not up the mountain, just into those little hills. We got lost and couldn't find our way back." Henry nodded vigorously. "As soon as we saw the lights, we came straight home, directly." Now it was Mr. and Mrs. Barker's turn to exchange glances. "You didn't go up the mountain?" Mr. Barker asked again, looking at Jack. "Nope," Jack insisted, "but we think Josie did. And there are mountain lions, aren't there, Mom? Isn't that what you said? And rattlesnakes, too." His eyes widened. "Do you think she'll be okay?" Mrs. Barker ran her fingers through Jack's hair, picking out bits of leaves and dirt. "What's all this?" she asked, crouching down to look at him. "Jack, did you fall?" Behind her glasses, her worried brown eyes made Henry cringe. But Jack brushed her off. "I just tripped," he said stoutly. "What about Josie?" "Listen to me, boys." The policeman straightened and crossed the kitchen floor in 2 strides. Henry saw that he had a bright silver badge and a leather holster that bulged with a gun, just like a real policeman. "You scared your mom and dad, you know that." He loomed over them. Simon and Henry nodded, and Jack asked, "Is that a real gun?" "It certainly is," the policeman said, "and I'll tell you what else. I've had to use it, up on Superstition Mountain." The boys looked at each other. You have?" Henry asked faintly. "Yes, I have." He paused and exchanged a long look with Henry's parents. It occurred to Henry that a whole separate conversation was going on between the grown-ups, one without any words. The policeman bent down now, hands on his knees, his broad, stern face inches from Henry's. "You don't want to be going up there. It's not safe. Understand?" Well, after the Barker brothers promise Officer Myers that they'll never, ever go up on Superstition Mountain again. And after hearing some wild stories about Uncle Hank and how he acted when he lived in town, Officer Myers leaves. And so it's time for supper and bed for the boys. And the boys decide that evening while they're talking in bed that there are 2 things that they want to do. Number 1 is find Josie. And number 2, they want to figure out the real danger of Superstition Mountain. The boys search for Josie for 3 days, but there's no sign of her. Finally, they decide to put up some posters around town. Maybe someone else has seen her. Chapter 7, a glimpse of something. After almost 2 hours of putting flyers on telephone poles in the boiling heat, all 3 boys were exhausted. They'd ridden down every street in the neighborhood. The sun was high in the cloudless sky, hot on their backs, flashing off cars, leaving them sweaty and thirsty. They just turned off Coronado Road to head home when Henry saw something out of the corner of his eye that made him slam on his brakes. It was a cat crossing a front yard, a black cat. He jumped off the side of his bike, letting it clatter against the curb. "Hey, Josie!" he cried. Before he could be sure, a girl who looked about his age had been sitting on the front porch of the house, leaped to her feet, grabbed the cat, and ran inside. Simon and Jack circled back to where Henry's bike lay in the gutter. "What happened?" Simon asked. "Did you fall off?" "No, I think I just saw Josie." "You did?" Jack jumped off his bike. "Where?" Henry stared at the house in bafflement. Maybe it wasn't, but it sure looked like Josie. A girl just took her inside that house. Simon lifted his bike onto the sidewalk and pushed down the kickstand. "Let's go see." They climbed the steps to the porch. "Knock on the door," Simon told Jack. Jack frowned. "You do it." "I'll do it," said Henry, but not before Jack stomped on Simon's foot and knocked on the door himself. A bang, bang, bang that echoed inside the house. The boys waited. Jack rang the bell. "Ding dong, ding dong." The boys waited some more. "I know she's in there," Henry said. He pressed his face against the window next to the door. "Hey, I can see the living room." He saw a flowery sofa, a glossy coffee table stacked with magazines, end tables cluttered with framed pictures, and a big fancy-looking green armchair with gold braiding. "It's very opulent." Simon and Jack crowded behind him. "Does that mean there's a cat in there?" Jack wanted to know. "Nope," Henry said, disappointed. "Let me see." Jack pushed in front of him. "Hey, there is a black cat. It's walking down the hall," he said. Then he cried excitedly, "Look, it's Josie!" "Really?" Simon elbowed between the two of them. Breathlessly, they watched a black cat wander into the living room and sit down, calmly licking her paws. There was a white patch on her neck, shaped like Florida. "It is Josie," Simon said. "What's she doing in there?" Josie was safe. She hadn't been eaten by mountain lions. She hadn't been bitten by a rattlesnake. She'd come down from the mountain all by herself, and she really didn't look any different at all. But what was she doing in this strange house? Henry pointed. "Look, there's the girl. She's hiding behind that chair." Behind one side of the green satiny armchair, they could see pink sneakers, a striped sleeve, and a long brown braid. Jack pounded on the door again. "We see you," he yelled. "Give us back our cat." The sneakers didn't move, but the braid swung sideways, and half a face appeared. It was a mad face. "Open the door!" Henry shouted. "Go away!" yelled the girl. She hid behind the chair again. Jack tried the handle of the front door, but it wouldn't open. "We have to save Josie," he said. "Josie, Josie, come here!" Josie looked up, gazing at them with her golden eyes. Henry thought she seemed unimpressed. "Josie!" he yelled. She started licking her paws again. The braid moved, and the whole face appeared this time. Henry could see a scattering of freckles. "Go away," the girl said loudly, glowering at them. "If you don't, I'll call the police." Simon was mad now, too. "No, we'll call the police. You stole our cat." "You'll go to jail," Jack cried. He made a horrible face, and he pressed it against the window. The girl came out from behind the chair and sat down next to Josie, stroking her back. "Leave us alone. You're the ones trespassing. You'll go to jail." She stuck out her tongue at Jack. The three boys looked at one another. Simon scanned the side of the house. "Let's see if there's another way in," he whispered. "You go away," the girl said again, and she put her arm around Josie, still petting her. Even through the window, the boys could tell that Josie was arching her back and purring. "Okay, we're leaving," Henry said loudly. The three boys stomped down the porch steps and walked toward the driveway. "Is she watching us?" Simon asked. Henry glanced back and shook his head. "Quick!" They raced around the side of the house to the backyard, then up the deck stairs to the sliding glass door. Simon grabbed the handle and pulled, but the door wouldn't budge. The girl walked into the kitchen holding Josie in her arms. "Ha!" she said. "It's locked." Jack pounded on the glass. "Cut it out," the girl said. "My mom is napping. You'll wake her up." Something about the way she said this made Henry think it wasn't true. He suddenly felt certain she was in the house alone. "Listen," Simon told her, jabbing his finger against the glass. "That's our cat. She's been missing for 3 whole days. You can't take somebody's cat." The girl held Josie tighter and glared. "It's not your cat. She's a stray. I found her." "She is not," Henry cried. "Look at her collar." The girl didn't move. "Can't we come in?" Henry asked. "Then we can show you." Josie continued to gaze at them impassively, almost as if they were strangers, Henry had to admit. But then she never was the kind of cat who acted excited to see anybody. "She's not your cat," the girl repeated stubbornly. She lowered Josie to the kitchen floor, and Josie darted back to the living room. "Let's go," Simon said to Henry and Jack. "She's not going to give us Josie, and I don't think there's anyone else home," he called over his shoulder. "You'll be sorry. Our mom is going to call your mom, and then you'll be in big trouble." As they walked across the yard, they heard the door slide open. "Wait," the girl said. The boys turned around. "Are you going to give Josie back?" Henry asked. The girl frowned at him. "Her name is Princess," she said. "Princess?" The boys looked at one another in disgust. Jack balled his fists and started back toward the deck, but Simon grabbed his shoulder. "Forget it," he said. "Mom will know what to do." So, at least they know where Josie is, but how are they going to get her back from this girl who calls Josie Princess? Ugh. Well, to find out, and to find out what the mystery is on Superstition Mountain and what those skulls are doing there, you can read Missing on Superstition Mountain by Elise Broach. It's available in print at EVPL. That's it for another Chapter Book Storytime. I hope you enjoyed this edition of the Variety Pack. We'll be back next week with more stories. Thanks so much for joining me. Bye-bye.